At 10:15 p.m. on the evening of Friday, April 14, 1865, a single gunshot rang out from the presidential box at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The audience had been laughing at a line from the comedy Our American Cousin. In that instant, laughter turned into confusion. A man in the box was seen struggling with the president. Another man, a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth, leaped from the box onto the stage, his spur catching on a draped flag. He fell awkwardly, broke his left leg, but rose quickly. He raised a dagger and shouted something in Latin, Sic semper tyrannis, then fled through the back door of the theater. Behind him, Abraham Lincoln slumped forward in his rocking chair, a bullet lodged behind his left eye. What had just happened? In the moments after the shot, chaos took over. The audience did not immediately understand that the president had been shot. Some thought the gunfire was part of the play. Then a woman screamed from the box. Mary Todd Lincoln had been holding her husband's hand when the bullet struck. She did not scream at first. She let out a low, helpless moan. Nearby, a young Army officer named Henry Rathbone tried to grab Booth, but Booth slashed him with a knife across the arm. Rathbone later described the blade cutting to the bone. Blood soaked his sleeve. The world of the theater collapsed into panic. Meanwhile, Lincoln had not fallen. He had slumped. His head lolled forward. His eyes were closed. He was not unconscious, but he was not responding. Major Rathbone, bleeding, rushed to the door of the box and called for a doctor. A young surgeon named Charles Leal, who was in the audience, pushed through the crowd. He climbed over the railing into the box. Leal found the president slumped in the chair, held upright by Mary Lincoln. Leal laid Lincoln on the floor. He felt for a pulse. It was weak. He opened Lincoln's mouth and found his tongue had fallen back, blocking his airway. He cleared it. Lincoln began to breathe again, but his breathing was shallow and irregular. Leal later wrote that the wound was mortal. There was nothing more to be done except to make him comfortable. At 10:30 p.m., Lincoln was carried out of the theater. 6 men held the stretcher, a narrow plank of wood, really, and moved him across the street to the Peterson house, a boarding house. The rain had started, the streets were muddy. The crowd outside the theater had grown and the soldiers struggled to clear a path. They laid Lincoln diagonally across a bed in a small back room because he was too tall to lie straight. The bed sagged under his weight. The room was dimly lit. Doctors gathered around. The cabinet was summoned. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived and took command of the scene. Stanton was the man who would turn chaos into investigation. Even as Lincoln lay dying, Stanton began to gather information. He ordered the telegraph lines cut out of Washington to prevent Booth from communicating with co-conspirators. He dispatched soldiers to patrol the streets. He sent telegrams ordering the arrest of anyone suspicious, and he began to interview witnesses. The first question he asked was simple: who did this? The answer came quickly. Several people in the theater had recognized Booth. He was a celebrated actor, known throughout the country. His face was unmistakable. Stanton now had a name, but Booth did not act alone. While Lincoln was being shot at Ford's Theater, another attack was unfolding less than a mile away. At the same hour, a man named Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, knocked on the door of Secretary of State William Henry Seward's home on Lafayette Square. Seward was recovering from a carriage accident and was confined to bed. Powell was admitted under a pretext. Then he drew a revolver and tried to shoot Seward. The gun misfired, so Powell used a knife. He stabbed Seward repeatedly in the face and neck. Seward's son, Frederick, and a servant, George Robinson, fought with Powell. Powell slashed them as well. He fled into the night, leaving Seward bleeding but alive. Another co-conspirator, George Atzerodt, had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel, but Atzerodt lost his nerve. He drank at the hotel bar and wandered away. Johnson was never attacked. This was a coordinated attempt to decapitate the federal government. Booth had planned for weeks. He had assembled a small group of sympathizers: Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier; George Atzerodt, a German immigrant and carriage painter; Mary Surratt, a boarding house owner; Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, former Confederate soldiers; and David Herold, a young pharmacy assistant. They met at Surratt's boarding house. Booth had hoped that killing Lincoln, Seward, and Johnson would throw the Union into disarray and allow the Confederate government, now in retreat, to regroup and continue the war. But the war had effectively ended 5 days earlier on April 9th, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The assassination was not a tactical military stroke. It was an act of vengeance, born of a fading cause. How could this have happened? The security at Ford's Theater that night was far from adequate. Lincoln had a single bodyguard, a Washington policeman named John Frederick Parker. Parker was not a Secret Service agent. The Secret Service did not exist yet. He was a patrolman assigned by the Metropolitan Police. Parker had a reputation for drinking and neglecting his duties. That night, he had escorted Lincoln to the theater and taken a seat in the outer lobby of the presidential box. But during the play, Parker left his post. He went to a nearby saloon for a drink. He may also have gone to watch the play from a different part of the theater, or simply wandered off. No one knows exactly why he was not at the door when Booth arrived. Booth knew the theater well. He knew that the lock on the door to the box was broken. He had deliberately loosened the screw that held the lock in place earlier that day. He then bored a peephole in the door so he could see the president. When he arrived, he simply pushed the door open. Parker was not there to stop him. The missed signals had been piling up for days. Booth had been seen lurking near the White House. He had left a letter at a hotel for a friend, hinting at something dramatic. A member of the theater staff had noticed Booth acting strangely, but none of this was connected. The intelligence network in Washington was fragmented. The Army ran its own surveillance. The police ran their own. The State Department had informants. None of them shared information effectively. Furthermore, the mood in the Capitol was euphoric after the surrender. The war was over. People were celebrating. Security around the president had been relaxed. Lincoln himself often resisted protection. He walked alone to the War Department. He received visitors without screening. He believed in ordinary access. That belief, combined with the negligence of his guard, gave Booth his opening. The manhunt began within hours. Stanton ordered the city locked down. Bridges were guarded. The Potomac was patrolled, but Booth and David Herold had already crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. They met up with a co-conspirator who had hidden weapons and supplies. They rode through the night to the home of a doctor named Samuel Mudd. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and let them rest. Then they continued south, hoping to cross into Virginia and eventually reach the Confederacy. But the Confederacy was dead. The roads were swarming with Union patrols. The assassination had turned every soldier into a hunter. Back at the Peterson house, Lincoln lay dying through the night. Doctors took turns holding his hand, checking his pulse. His breathing became more labored. His eyes had swollen shut from the pressure of the bullet. At about 7 a.m. on April 15th, his breathing stopped. He was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m., Stanton said. Now he belongs to the ages. The exact phrase is debated, but the meaning is clear. The 16th president was gone. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in American history up to that point. Stanton led the effort, working with the military and civilian detectives. They interviewed hundreds of people. They traced Booth's movements in the weeks before the assassination. They searched his hotel room and found a trunk containing a diary, a map, and letters. The diary became critical evidence. In it, Booth had written about his hatred of Lincoln, his belief that the president was a tyrant, and his conviction that he, Booth, would be remembered as a hero. The diary also recorded his frustrations after the surrender. He had considered kidnapping Lincoln earlier, but the plan collapsed. Assassination was the last resort. The conspiracy did not end with Booth. Mary Surratt was arrested at her boarding house. Soldiers found carbines, ammunition, and other supplies hidden there. She was tried by a military commission and sentenced to death. She was hanged on July 7, 1865, along with Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Herold. Samuel Mudd was sentenced to life in prison for aiding Booth, though he was later pardoned. The trials were controversial. The use of a military tribunal for civilians raised questions about due process that have still not been fully settled. But in the aftermath of the assassination, the nation wanted swift justice. Booth himself was cornered on April 26 at a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. The barn was set on fire to flush him out. He refused to surrender. A soldier named Boston Corbett shot him through the neck, severing his spinal cord. Booth was dragged out and died on the porch of the farmhouse a few hours later. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "Tell my mother I die for my country." The diary and other personal effects were taken. The man who had tried to destroy the government was dead. The systems that failed in this event were not mechanical, they were human ones. Security protocols that existed on paper were not enforced. The police department did not discipline Parker. The War Department had intelligence about Booth but did not act. The medical system had no way to save Lincoln. Neurosurgery was primitive, and the bullet had penetrated the brain beyond any reach. But beyond that, the failure was deeper. It was a failure to anticipate that a war ending in victory could still produce a violent response. The joy of the surrender had blinded the capital to the rage of those who rejected it. Why does this event still matter? Because the assassination changed the course of Reconstruction. Lincoln had planned a moderate and conciliatory policy toward the defeated Southern states. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds. With his death, the Vice President Andrew Johnson took over. Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat, and a man with far less political skill. He clashed with Congress. He opposed civil rights for freed slaves. His presidency led to impeachment, though he was acquitted by one vote. The radical Republicans gained power and pushed through a harsher Reconstruction that left lasting scars. The assassination also cemented Lincoln as a martyr. His death transformed him from a controversial wartime leader into an almost saintly figure, a symbol of unity and sacrifice. That image persists today. The unanswered questions from that night remain. Could the assassination have been prevented if Parker had stayed at his post? Could Booth have been captured alive if the barn had not been set on fire? Did other co-conspirators escape justice? The historical record has been picked apart by scholars for over 150 years, and still, some details are not clear. What is clear is that a single bullet, fired at a moment when the nation was celebrating its survival, sent the entire country into a new and uncertain direction. The war was over, but the cost of that war was not finished being paid. At 8 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1865, the body of Abraham Lincoln was carried across the street from the Peterson House to the White House. The journey took only a few minutes. The streets were silent. Crowds had gathered in the rain. Soldiers lined the path. No one spoke. Inside the White House, Lincoln's remains were placed in a temporary coffin and taken to the guest room on the second floor. The room was draped in black cloth. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had collapsed and was not present. She had been led away from the Peterson house hours earlier, hysterical and unable to comprehend what had happened. The president's corpse was washed, embalmed, and dressed in a black suit. The embalming process was crude by modern standards, but it was necessary. The funeral would not be immediate. The nation needed time to mourn. At 10 a.m., Secretary of War Edwin Stanton issued a formal announcement. The president was dead. The telegraph wires carried the news across the country within hours. In New York City, crowds gathered outside newspaper offices. In Chicago, bells rang. In Richmond, the Confederate capital that had fallen just days earlier, the news was met with a mixture of fear and defiance. The assassin had struck at the very moment when peace seemed possible. The reaction was not uniform. Some in the South quietly celebrated. Most understood that Lincoln's death would only bring harsher terms. They were right. The funeral itself was delayed until April 19th to allow for preparation. On that Wednesday morning, a procession formed at the White House. The casket was placed on a hearse drawn by 6 white horses. The procession moved slowly down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. The streets were lined with thousands of people. Many wore black, some wept. Soldiers marched in formation. The hearse passed the partially completed dome of the Capitol, a symbol of a nation still unfinished. The casket was placed in the rotunda, where it would lie in state. At least 25,000 people filed past the open coffin over the next 2 days. The line stretched for blocks. Some waited hours. They came to see the face of the man who had preserved the Union. Then came the funeral train. It was not a simple journey. Stanton and others decided that Lincoln's body should be taken home to Springfield, Illinois, for burial. The route would trace the same path he had taken as president-elect in 1861, but in reverse. The train would stop in major cities along the way. The goal was to allow the American people to pay their respects. The train departed Washington on April 21st at 8 a.m. It consisted of 9 cars, including a specially designed funeral car draped in black velvet and fringed with silver. Lincoln's coffin was placed in the rear car, surrounded by flowers and memorial wreaths. The train traveled north through Baltimore, then to Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and finally Chicago. At each stop, the casket was removed and placed in a public building. Hundreds of thousands of people viewed it. The journey took 12 days. What happened during that journey reveals something about the nation's grief. In Philadelphia, the casket was placed in Independence Hall. The room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed became the site of a vigil. In New York City, the procession through Manhattan was so large that it took hours. The city's population had nearly doubled since the war began, and nearly everyone turned out. The funeral car passed under a massive arch of black and white cloth erected at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue. The coffin was displayed at City Hall. By the time the train reached Springfield, an estimated 7 million people had seen the president's remains. That number is difficult to verify, but the scale of public mourning was unprecedented. The assassination had not only killed a man, it had shattered the emotional closure that the end of the war had promised. For many Northerners, Lincoln had been the embodiment of the Union cause. His death turned victory into tragedy. For African Americans, the loss was particularly devastating. Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He had pushed for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and was ratified later that year. He was seen as a liberator. Freedmen and women lined the funeral route in silence. Some later reported that they felt the world had gone dark. But behind the public mourning, a different kind of work was underway. Stanton had assembled a team of investigators to find every person connected to the conspiracy. The hunt for Booth was the most urgent, but there were others. Lewis Powell, who had attacked Seward, was captured on April 17th at Mary Surratt's boarding house. He had shown up claiming to be a laborer, but his story collapsed. George Atzerodt, the man assigned to kill Vice President Johnson, had lost his nerve. He had gotten drunk and wandered the streets of Washington. He was captured on April 20th. David Herold, who had accompanied Booth, was still with him at that point, but the net was closing. The pursuit of Booth and Herold lasted 12 days. After leaving Dr. Mudd's house, they moved south through Maryland. They crossed the Potomac River into Virginia on April 21st, but the river crossing was slow. They had to pay a ferryman to bring them across under cover of darkness. Once in Virginia, they moved toward the Rappahannock River. The terrain was swampy. Booth's leg was still painful and he could not ride quickly. They stopped at a farm owned by a man named Richard Garrett. Booth gave a false name. The Garretts allowed them to stay in a tobacco barn. Meanwhile, the Union cavalry was closing in. Colonel Everton Conger led a detachment of the 16th New York Cavalry. They had tracked Booth through a series of informants. On April 24th, they learned that a man matching Booth's description had crossed the Potomac. On April 25th, they reached the Garrett farm. They surrounded the barn at around 2 a.m. on April 26th. Inside, Booth and Herold were asleep. The soldiers demanded surrender. Herold came out. Booth did not. What happened next is still debated. The barn was set on fire. The order to burn it may have come from Conger or from a detective named Luther Baker. Some accounts say the fire was meant to smoke Booth out. Others say it was a tactical mistake. Inside the barn, Booth dropped his crutch and raised a carbine. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He may have been considering surrender, but a soldier named Boston Corbett fired his revolver through a crack in the barn wall. The bullet struck Booth in the back of the head, severing his spinal cord. He fell. Soldiers dragged him out of the burning barn and laid him on the porch of the farmhouse. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He asked the soldiers to lift his hands so he could see them. He whispered, "Tell my mother I die for my country." He died at around 7 a.m. Corbett's shot was controversial. Stanton had wanted Booth taken alive for trial. Some suspected that Corbett had acted deliberately to prevent Booth from speaking. Corbett claimed he saw Booth aiming a pistol and fired in self-defense. He was never court-martialed. The military tribunal accepted his account. Booth's body was taken back to Washington, identified and buried in a secret location. It was later moved to a grave in the family plot in Baltimore, but the secrecy surrounding the burial fueled rumors that Booth had escaped. Those rumors persist in some circles today. With Booth dead, the focus shifted to the trial of the remaining conspirators. The trial began on May 9, 1865, before a military commission of 9 officers. The decision to use a military tribunal instead of a civilian court was controversial. President Johnson approved it. Stanton argued that the conspirators had acted as enemy combatants during a time of war. Critics said the Constitution required a civilian trial. The commission met in a chamber in the Washington Arsenal. The defendants sat in a row, their legs shackled. They were Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Herold, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler. All were charged with conspiracy to murder the president. The prosecution presented over 300 witnesses. The defense had less than 200. The trial lasted until June 28th. The evidence against Surratt was circumstantial but damning. Her boarding house had been a meeting place for Booth and his co-conspirators. She had delivered a package containing field glasses to Booth on the day of the assassination. She claimed she did not know what he planned. The court did not believe her. The verdict was issued on June 30th. 4 defendants, Surratt, Powell, Atzerodt, and Herold, were sentenced to death by hanging. Mudd, O'Laughlin, and Arnold received life in prison. Spangler got 6 years. The executions were carried out on July 7, 1865, in the yard of the Washington Arsenal. Gallows had been built. The 4 prisoners were brought out at 1:15 p.m. A crowd of over 1,000 watched. Surratt wore a black dress and a bonnet. She was attended by 2 priests. Powell, the giant man who had attacked Seward, stood calmly. Atzerodt shook. Herold cried. The nooses were placed. A signal was given. The floor dropped. They fell. Surratt's neck was broken quickly. Powell and Herold struggled for several minutes. Atzerodt died within seconds. Their bodies were left hanging for 20 minutes before being cut down and buried in shallow graves. The trial and executions left deep scars. Many questioned whether Surratt should have been hanged. Some of the commissioners later expressed doubt about her guilt. The military commission itself set a precedent for using military courts in civilian cases, a precedent that would be cited in later conflicts. The swift justice of 1865 was a response to a crisis, but it also raised questions about due process that the nation has never fully resolved. How could this have happened? The assassination itself was not the only failure. The system that followed was a system of emergency measures. The military tribunal, the mass arrests, the denial of habeas corpus for some suspects, all were justified by the war. But the war was over. The reasoning was that the conspirators had acted in aid of the rebellion, and the rebellion was still technically ongoing until the formal end of hostilities. That argument held, but barely. The deeper failure was structural. The United States in 1865 had no agency dedicated to protecting the president. The Secret Service would be created later that year, but its initial mission was to combat counterfeiting, not to guard the president. It took another assassination, that of President William McKinley in 1901, before Congress formally assigned the Secret Service to protect the chief executive. Lincoln died because the security apparatus of the state was not designed for the kind of threat he faced. What investigators found after the assassination was a network of conspirators that was larger than initially believed. Booth had connections to Confederate secret agents operating in Canada. There were reports of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government. Some historians argue that the conspiracy was more extensive than the trial revealed. Others say Booth acted primarily on his own initiative, with only a small group of loyalists. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Confederate government officially condemned the assassination, but some of its agents had been involved in earlier plots to kidnap Lincoln. The line between official policy and rogue action remains blurred. The unanswered questions persist. Why did John Frederick Parker, the bodyguard, face no serious punishment? He was charged with neglect of duty but acquitted. He remained on the police force until 1868, when he was dismissed for sleeping on duty. He died in obscurity. Why did Stanton, a man known for his efficiency, not ensure better protection for the president? The answer may be that Stanton and Lincoln had a complicated relationship. Stanton was abrasive and often dismissive of Lincoln's leadership. But he was also fiercely loyal. He may have simply assumed that the threat had passed with the surrender. Why was Booth able to walk into the theater unchallenged? The ticket taker knew him as an actor. No one searched him. The guard was absent. The lock was broken. The peephole had been drilled. Every piece of the plan depended on a chain of small failures. They all aligned. Why does this event still matter? Because the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not just the death of a president. It was the death of a vision for Reconstruction. Lincoln had described his plan in terms of malice toward none and charity for all. With his death, that approach was replaced by a struggle between a vengeful Congress and a weak president. The result was a Reconstruction that left deep racial divisions, economic inequality, and political resentment that lasted for generations. The opportunity to build a truly unified nation was lost. The cost of that loss is still being paid. The assassination also changed how Americans think about their leaders. Lincoln became a martyr, but martyrdom is a double-edged sword. It sanctifies a person, but it also freezes them in time. Lincoln, after his death, was no longer a politician who could make mistakes. He became an icon. That icon has been used to justify many causes, some of which Lincoln himself might not have supported. The real man, with his complexities and contradictions, was replaced by a statue. The story of April 14, 1865, is a story of a war ending and a war continuing. The guns fell silent at Appomattox, but the violence did not stop. Booth's bullet was the last shot of the Civil War, and the first shot of a new conflict that would define the next century. That conflict was fought not on battlefields, but in courthouses, legislatures, and the hearts of citizens. It was a conflict over what kind of country the United States would become. Lincoln's death made that conflict harder to resolve. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, a doctor said, "He is gone." The room fell silent. The war was over, but the war was also just beginning. At 8:15 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the news reached the streets of Washington. The telegraph wires carried the message in every direction. Within hours, the entire nation knew. The president was dead. The reaction was not uniform. In the North, grief and anger swept through cities and towns. Buildings were draped in black. Churches held services. In the South, the response was more complicated. Some mourned. Others saw the assassination as a desperate act of a dying cause. A few celebrated, but quietly, for fear of reprisal. The Confederate government, now in retreat, issued a statement denying any involvement. Jefferson Davis, captured a month later, would be accused of complicity. He was never tried for it. The evidence was thin. But the suspicion lingered. What remained after Lincoln's death was a machinery of mourning that had never been used for a president before. The funeral train left Washington on April 21st. It followed the same route Lincoln had taken to his inauguration in 1861, but in reverse. The journey lasted 13 days. It passed through Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, and finally Springfield, Illinois. At each stop, the casket was taken off the train and placed in a public building. Thousands of citizens filed past. The total number of mourners who viewed the body is estimated at over 1 million. The train itself was a rolling symbol of a nation in transition. It carried not just a body, but a set of promises that had not been kept. The funeral was a national event, but also a political one. The organizers of the ceremony understood that Lincoln's death could be used to rally support for a harsh Reconstruction. The eulogies emphasized the need to finish the work Lincoln had begun, but the interpretation of that work was left vague. Some speakers called for mercy, others demanded punishment. The ambiguity would soon be resolved by the men who now held power. Andrew Johnson, the new president, took the oath of office at 11 a.m. on April 15th, just hours after Lincoln's death. The ceremony was brief. Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. He was a poor Southerner who despised the planter aristocracy. He was also a racist who believed that African Americans should not have the right to vote. His views put him at odds with the radical Republicans in Congress. The clash that followed would shape the next decade. Johnson's first moves were lenient. He issued a proclamation of amnesty for most former Confederates. He allowed Southern states to form new governments, as long as they ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But he did not require them to grant black men the right to vote. The result was a wave of black codes, laws that restricted the freedom of former slaves. The codes varied by state but commonly included curfews, vagrancy laws, and restrictions on property ownership and employment. They were designed to keep black labor under white control. The North watched with alarm. What happened next was a direct consequence of the power vacuum left by Lincoln's death. The radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, believed that the Southern states had forfeited their rights by seceding. They argued that Congress, not the president, should control Reconstruction. Johnson vetoed their bills. Congress overrode his vetoes. The struggle escalated. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into military districts and required new state constitutions that guaranteed black suffrage. Johnson continued to resist. In 1868, the House impeached him for violating the Tenure of Office Act, a law designed to protect the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, from removal. The Senate fell one vote short of conviction. Johnson remained in office, but his power was broken. How could this have happened? The assassination did not cause the conflict between Johnson and Congress. That conflict was built into the structure of American politics, but it accelerated it. Lincoln had been able to manage the tensions through a combination of personal authority, political skill, and the shared purpose of winning the war. With him gone, there was no one who could hold the coalition together. The balance tipped toward confrontation. The deeper failure was a failure of political imagination. Lincoln had envisioned a Reconstruction based on reconciliation. He had already implemented a moderate plan in Louisiana, where a new state government recognized the end of slavery but did not require black suffrage. He was willing to move slowly, hoping that time would ease the transition. But his plan was not universally accepted. The radicals wanted immediate equal rights. The South wanted to restore white supremacy. Lincoln might have found a middle path. After his death, no one could. The consequences were catastrophic. The period known as Radical Reconstruction lasted from 1867 to 1877. During that time, black men voted for the first time. They served in state legislatures and in Congress. They helped write new state constitutions that established public schools, expanded women's rights, and reformed the tax system. But the gains were met with violent resistance. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866. It used terrorism to intimidate black voters and their white allies. Paramilitary groups like the White League and the Red Shirts carried out massacres. In Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, more than 100 black men were killed after they surrendered. The federal government responded with the Enforcement Acts, which allowed the president to suspend habeas corpus in areas of unrest. But the commitment to enforcement waned. By 1877, Reconstruction was over. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. White Democrats regained control of every state government. The new constitutions were replaced by laws that disenfranchised black voters, segregated public facilities, and enforced a system of racial subordination known as Jim Crow. This system would last for nearly a century. The assassination of Lincoln was not the sole cause of this outcome, but it was the point at which the trajectory changed. With Lincoln alive, there was a chance that Reconstruction might have taken a different course. With him dead, the forces of reaction had an opening. The history of the next 100 years is in many ways the story of that opening being exploited. What investigators found in the years after the assassination was not just a conspiracy of 7 or 8 people, but a network of sympathizers that stretched across the South and into Canada. The Confederate Secret Service, under the direction of agents like John Thompson and Jacob Thompson, had been active in Canada, plotting operations against the Union. They had burned ships, attempted to set fire to New York City, and spread counterfeit currency. Booth had visited Canada in 1864. He had met with Confederate agents. The exact nature of those meetings is unclear, but the circumstantial evidence is strong. He received money. He made plans. The kidnapping plot that preceded the assassination was known to Confederate officials. Some historians argue that the assassination itself was a Confederate operation. Others maintain that Booth acted alone, with only the support of a small circle of friends. The truth is likely that Booth was inspired by the Confederate cause but not directly ordered to kill Lincoln. The Confederate government had no interest in a Union martyr, but the environment of war, the desperation of the final months, and the availability of weapons and money made the assassination possible. The line between private fanaticism and official policy was blurry. It remains blurry. The unanswered questions continue to haunt the historical record. Where did Booth get the money for his escape? Who helped him cross the Potomac? Why did some witnesses claim to have seen Booth in different places at the same time after his death? The body that was identified as Booth's was burned on the deck of the ironclad Montauk. The autopsy was performed by a surgeon who had served in the Union Army. The identification was made by people who knew Booth, including his dentist. But the body was buried in a secret location and later exhumed and reburied several times. In 1869, Edwin Booth, John Wilkes' brother, was allowed to view the remains. He confirmed the identity. Still, the rumors persisted. They persist today. No credible evidence supports the theory that Booth escaped, but the mystery adds a layer of uncertainty to an already uncertain story. The assassination also changed the way the government thought about security. In 1865, the Secret Service was established as a bureau of the Treasury Department. Its first mission was to suppress counterfeit currency. The protection of the president was not added to its duties until 1902, after the assassination of William McKinley. The gap is telling. For 37 years after Lincoln's death, the president had no dedicated security detail. The threat was not taken seriously. Congress assumed that one assassination was a fluke. It took another to prove them wrong. The failures of April 14, 1865 led to reforms, but slowly. The peephole in the door to the president's box at Ford's Theater was never repaired. The theater itself was later closed, turned into a warehouse, and then into a museum. The building still stands. The box is preserved. Visitors can see the exact spot where Lincoln sat. The flag that was draped over his box is in a case nearby. The museum tells the story of the assassination and its aftermath. It is a place where history is made tangible. Why does this event still matter? Because the questions it raises are not limited to 1865. The conflict between security and liberty, between mercy and justice, between federal power and states' rights, between racial equality and white supremacy. These conflicts did not end with Lincoln's death. They continued through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, and into the present day. The assassination was a moment when the nation chose one path over another. That choice still defines the country. The legacy of Lincoln's death is also a legacy of unanswered questions. Could the wounds of the Civil War have healed more quickly if he had lived? Could the nation have avoided the century of segregation and violence that followed? The answer is unknowable. But the question forces us to consider the role of individuals in history. Lincoln was one man. His death changed the course of events. That is a reminder of how fragile political systems are and how much depends on the character of those who lead them. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was the first murder of a president. It was not the last. The pattern of political violence in the United States was set on that night. The bullet fired into a crowded theater was a declaration that the government could be attacked from within. The men who fired it believed they were patriots. They were wrong, but their act echoed through the decades. It echoed in the shootings of Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. It echoes today in a society that still struggles with the idea that disagreement can be resolved through argument, not violence. The lesson of April 14, 1865 is that war does not end when the shooting stops. It ends when the hatred stops, and that takes longer, much longer. The guns of the Civil War fell silent at Appomattox, but the war inside the nation's heart did not. Lincoln understood that. He tried to end it. His assassination made it nearly impossible. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the doctor said, "He is gone." The room fell silent. The war was over, but the war was also just beginning. That beginning would last for generations. The end is still not here. At 10 o'clock on the night of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. The bridge guard had orders to stop anyone after 9 p.m., but Booth was recognized and allowed to pass. He met David Herold, a co-conspirator, on the road. Together they rode south. By midnight, they had stopped at the tavern of Mary Surratt's boarding house to retrieve weapons and supplies that had been stashed earlier. Then they continued into the Maryland countryside. At sunrise on April 15th, the search was already underway. The War Department dispatched cavalry and detectives across Washington and into Maryland. President Lincoln was dead. The assassination of Secretary of State William Seward was known, but he was still alive, though badly wounded. Booth's accomplice Lewis Powell had stabbed Seward multiple times in his bed but failed to kill him. Another conspirator, George Atzerodt, had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve. The plan had been a triple assassination designed to decapitate the Union government. Only one of the three targets had died. At 9 a.m. on April 15th, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered the arrest of everyone associated with the conspiracy. He also issued a description of Booth, his photograph, his height, his distinctive mustache and dark eyes. A reward of $100,000 was offered for his capture. The telegraph lines hummed with instructions. Every military commander, every police station, every train station was put on alert. Booth was somewhere in the countryside, but the net was closing. What happened over the next 12 days was a manhunt that stretched across Maryland and Virginia. Booth and Herold moved through a network of Confederate sympathizers. They received food, horses, and shelter from farmers who still harbored loyalty to the South. One of those was Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician who treated Booth's broken leg. Booth had fractured his leg when he jumped from the presidential box to the stage at Ford's Theater. Mudd set the bone and let them rest. This act would later cost Mudd his freedom. On April 20th, the two fugitives crossed the Potomac River into Virginia. The crossing was perilous. The river was wide and current strong. They missed the planned landing point and ended up stranded on a marsh. They eventually made contact with Confederate agents and moved inland. Booth kept a diary. In it he wrote that he believed he had done a good deed, that history would vindicate him. He never expressed regret for killing Lincoln. He saw himself as a hero. On April 24th, the search focused on the area near the Rappahannock River. Union cavalry under Lieutenant Edward Doherty and a detachment of the 16th New York Cavalry were tracking the pair. They had informants. On April 25th, they learned that Booth and Herold were hiding at Richard Garrett's farm in Caroline County, Virginia. The farm was a tobacco plantation. The cavalry arrived on the night of April 26th. At 2 o'clock in the morning on April 26th, the soldiers surrounded the barn. Inside were Booth and Herold. They were ordered to surrender. Herold came out. Booth refused. The barn was set on fire. Booth was still inside, armed with a carbine and 2 revolvers. A sergeant named Boston Corbett fired a shot through a crack in the wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. Booth was dragged from the burning barn. He died 3 hours later at dawn on the porch of the Garrett house. His last words were said to be, "Tell my mother I died for my country." He was 26 years old. The body was taken to Washington. It was identified by people who knew Booth, his dentist, his doctor, his friends. The identification was then verified by his brother, Edwin Booth, who arrived from Boston. The body was autopsied on the ironclad USS Montauk. The bullet was removed from his neck. Then the body was buried in a secret location under a stone floor in the Washington Arsenal. Later, it was exhumed and reburied in the Booth family plot in Baltimore. But the secrecy and the multiple burials fed rumors that Booth had escaped. No credible evidence ever supported those rumors, but they persist to this day. The trial of the conspirators began on May 9, 1865, before a military commission. The defendants were 8 people: David Herold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler. The trial was held in Washington, in a room that had been a prison. The defendants were manacled and hooded. The proceedings were closed to the public in some sessions. The military commission did not require a unanimous verdict, only a 2/3 majority. The standard of evidence was lower than in civilian courts. The prosecution argued that all 8 were part of a larger conspiracy to destroy the Union government. The defense argued that only Booth and a few close associates had planned the assassination. The evidence was mixed. Mary Surratt owned the boarding house where the conspirators had met. She had delivered weapons to the tavern in Maryland. But she was a woman, and many believed she was merely following orders from her son, John Surratt, who had fled to Canada. Still, the commission found her guilty. Arnold and O'Laughlin were given life sentences. Mudd was sentenced to life, though he argued he had only treated a patient. Spangler, a stagehand at Ford's Theater, got 6 years. Herold, Powell, Atzerodt, and Surratt were sentenced to death. On July 7, 1865, the 4 were hanged at the Washington Arsenal. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the federal government. Her execution was controversial. Some of the commission members had recommended clemency, but President Andrew Johnson refused. He signed the death warrant. The hangings were public. Thousands watched. The bodies were buried on the Arsenal grounds. The execution ended the official legal response to the assassination. But the questions did not end. What investigators found in the months after the trial was a network far larger than the 8 defendants. Confederate Secret Service agents in Canada, including John Thompson and Jacob Thompson, had funded and directed operations throughout the war. Booth had visited Canada in October 1864. He had met with these agents. He had received a sum of money. The exact amount and purpose remain unclear, but the timing aligns with his shift from kidnapping plots to assassination. Some historians believe the assassination was authorized, or at least encouraged, by Confederate officials. Others argue that Booth acted alone, using Confederate money for his own plans. The unanswered questions multiply. Who else knew? Why did the plot succeed when many similar plots failed? Could it have been stopped? The evidence suggests that several people knew something. John Surratt, who escaped to Canada and later to Europe, the Confederate agents in Canada, perhaps even higher-ranking officials in Richmond. but no documented order from Confederate President Jefferson Davis or Secretary of War James Seddon has ever been found. Davis denied any knowledge. After the war, he was indicted for conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln but never tried. The case was dropped. The truth remains buried in the archives. The assassination also changed the course of Reconstruction. The man who took Lincoln's place, Andrew Johnson, was a Southerner and a Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, but he held deep racial prejudices. He opposed the idea of black citizenship. He wanted to restore the Southern states quickly, without guarantees for freedmen. In May 1865, he issued a proclamation of amnesty for most Confederates and began appointing provisional governors who were former Confederates. The state governments that emerged under Johnson's plan passed black codes, laws that restricted the movement, labor, and rights of freed slaves. Congress, controlled by the radical Republicans, fought back. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States. They overrode Johnson's vetoes. They divided the South into military districts and required states to ratify the 14th Amendment before being readmitted to the Union. The struggle between Johnson and Congress defined the next 3 years. Johnson was impeached in 1868 but acquitted by 1 vote. The political chaos weakened the federal government's resolve and eroded public support for Reconstruction. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted, but the federal troops that had enforced Reconstruction began to be withdrawn. The violence against black voters escalated. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866, spread terror across the South. In many areas, black communities were attacked, their leaders killed, their churches burned. The federal government passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 and used them to prosecute some Klansmen, but the effort was uneven and short-lived. In 1877, the Compromise of 1877 ended federal intervention entirely. The disputed presidential election of 1876 was resolved by a deal that gave the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the removal of federal troops from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Reconstruction was over. The Southern states then enacted Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised black voters, segregated public facilities, and enforced racial hierarchy through violence and intimidation. This system would last for nearly a century. The assassination of Lincoln was not the only cause of this outcome. The failure of Reconstruction had many roots: economic interests, racism, political corruption, and a national exhaustion with the war. But the assassination removed a president who had shown a willingness to protect the rights of freedmen and to push for a moderate, lenient Reconstruction that included protections for the former slaves. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered just 6 weeks before his death, had called for malice toward none, with charity for all. That vision was lost when the bullet struck. What systems failed on April 14, 1865? The security at Ford's Theater was one of them. The president's box had no guard. The door was not locked. The theater manager had left the balcony doors unlatched. The city police had been told to protect the president, but they did not assign a specific officer to his box. The Secret Service did not exist yet. The president's safety was left to chance. That chance was exploited, but the failures went deeper. The intelligence apparatus of the Union government had been aware of threats to Lincoln. There had been rumors of assassination plots throughout the war. Lincoln himself often dismissed them. He walked through Washington without guards. He attended the theater without escort. He was a target, but no one took the threat seriously enough. After his death, security for presidents was tightened, but not immediately. It took another assassination, that of James Garfield in 1881, to create a permanent Secret Service detail for presidents. And even then, the shift was slow. The Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, noted similarities to Lincoln's assassination. Both were public killings. Both were carried out by lone gunmen with fringe political beliefs. Both highlighted the vulnerability of public officials. The pattern of political violence in America, from Lincoln to Garfield to McKinley to Kennedy, is a pattern of moments where the system failed to protect its leaders. Each time, reforms followed. Each time, the reforms proved insufficient. Why does the assassination of Lincoln still matter? Because it changed the trajectory of American history at a critical moment. Lincoln had a vision for Reconstruction that was moderate but firm. He wanted to bring the South back into the Union quickly, but he also wanted to ensure the former slaves were free in fact as well as in law. His death removed that vision from the center of power. The men who replaced him, Johnson and then Grant, did not have the same skill, the same political capital, or the same moral clarity. Reconstruction became a bitter political struggle, not a healing process. The legacy of that failure is still present. The racial divisions that were entrenched after Reconstruction persisted through the 20th century. The civil rights movement of the 1960s overturned Jim Crow, but the economic and social disparities that were created under that system remain. The question of whether Lincoln could have prevented this is speculative, but the speculation itself is a way of understanding the weight of historical contingency. One man's death changed everything. The assassination also revealed the power of belief. Booth believed he was a patriot. He believed he was striking a blow against tyranny. He was wrong, but his conviction inspired others. The Confederate cause outlived the war in the hearts of many Southerners. The assassination turned Lincoln into a martyr, but it also turned Booth into a symbol for the lost cause. In the decades that followed, some Southerners celebrated Booth as a hero. Confederate memorials were erected. The narrative of the war as a noble struggle for states' rights, not slavery, became dominant in the South. That narrative persisted until the present century. The investigations into the assassination did not stop with the trial. In 1867, a congressional committee investigated the role of Confederate officials. They interviewed witnesses, examined documents, and concluded that there was evidence of Confederate involvement, but not enough to prosecute. The report was filed and forgotten. In 1977, a historian named William Hanchett argued that the conspiracy was larger than previously believed. He pointed to the activities of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada and the contacts with Booth. He also noted that several key witnesses had died or disappeared before they could testify. The full truth may never be known. The human consequences of the assassination were profound. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered. She had been sitting next to her husband when he was shot. She sank into depression. Her grief was compounded by the public scrutiny of her behavior. She was criticized for her spending, her eccentricities, her apparent lack of decorum. Her son Tad died in 1879. Her oldest son Robert committed her to a mental institution in 1875. She was released and then committed again. She died in 1882, a broken woman. The children of the conspirators also suffered. Mary Surratt's daughter tried to clear her mother's name for decades. Samuel Mudd's family campaigned for his pardon, which was granted posthumously. The families of the executed men carried the stigma of treason. The stories of the assassination were passed down through generations, each telling colored by regional loyalties and political beliefs. In the years after 1865, Ford's Theater was closed by order of the War Department. It was used as a warehouse for government records. In 1893, the building collapsed, killing 22 people. It was rebuilt as a museum. In 1932, the site became a national memorial. Today, the theater is restored to its 1865 appearance. The box where Lincoln sat is preserved. Below the theater, a museum displays artifacts from the assassination, including the gun Booth used, the clothes Lincoln wore, and the diary Booth wrote. The museum tells the story of the assassination and the aftermath, but it also tells the story of the nation after the war. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was the first time a president was killed in office. It was not the last. The pattern of political violence in the United States is a thread that runs from 1865 to the present. Each assassination or attempt reveals something about the society that produced it. Lincoln's assassination revealed a nation divided by war, hatred, and a failure of imagination. The nation could not imagine a peaceful transition from war to peace. It could not imagine a multiracial democracy. The bullet that killed Lincoln was the product of that failure. At 2 a.m. on the 15th of April, 1865, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood in a room at the Peterson House, just across the street from Ford's Theater. President Lincoln had been declared dead less than an hour earlier. Stanton's first order was to begin a manhunt. He issued telegrams to every military post, railroad station, and police department in the region. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, had fled into the night. The search for him would become the largest manhunt in American history up to that time. Booth had escaped Washington on horseback. He crossed the Navy Yard Bridge, which was supposed to be guarded. The sentry on duty did not recognize him, but Booth convinced the soldier that he was simply going home. The bridge was a critical choke point. The sentry allowed him through. No one was notified that a bridge crossing had occurred after the assassination. That failure gave Booth a head start of several hours. Booth met his co-conspirator David Herold at a prearranged location in the Maryland countryside. The two men rode south toward Virginia. Booth had broken his left leg when he jumped from the president's box to the stage of the theater. The injury was painful but not disabling. He needed medical attention. At roughly 4 a.m., the two men arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician who lived in Charles County, Maryland. Mudd set Booth's leg, applied a splint, and gave him crutches. He did not report the visit to authorities. What did Mudd know? He claimed later that he did not recognize Booth. But he had met Booth before. The question of Mudd's involvement in the conspiracy remains debated. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. He was eventually pardoned by President Andrew Johnson in 1869. The ambiguity surrounding Mudd's role is one of the unanswered questions of the assassination. The manhunt continued for 12 days. Stanton ordered a blockade of the Potomac River. Cavalry units searched every farm, forest, and swamp in southern Maryland. Booth and Herold moved from safe house to safe house, helped by Confederate sympathizers who hid them, fed them, and pointed them toward the Potomac. The network of support was organized. Booth had prearranged contacts. Conspiracy was not a single day's work. It had been planned for weeks. On April 24th, Booth and Herold finally crossed the Potomac into Virginia. They were headed toward the Deep South, where Booth believed he would be welcomed as a hero, but the Union Army was closing in. On April 26, the two men took shelter at the farm of Richard Garrett near Port Royal, Virginia. They were hiding in a tobacco barn when the 16th New York Cavalry surrounded the building at 2 in the morning. The cavalrymen ordered the men to surrender. Herold came out. Booth refused. What happened next is documented in conflicting accounts. The soldiers set the barn on fire. Booth was still inside, armed with a revolver. He made no attempt to surrender. A sergeant named Boston Corbett fired his pistol through a crack in the barn wall. The bullet struck Booth in the back of the neck, severing his spinal cord. Booth was dragged from the burning building. He was paralyzed. He died 3 hours later on the porch of the Garrett house. His last words, according to witnesses, were "useless, useless." The soldiers searched his body and found a diary, a compass, and a photograph of 5 women. The diary contained entries that some historians believe were tampered with. Pages were missing. The question of what was removed and by whom remains another unresolved mystery. The official response to the assassination did not end with Booth's death. At 9:30 a.m. on May 9, 1865, a military commission began the trial of 8 conspirators. The trial was held in Washington, D.C. The defendants included Mary Surratt, the owner of a boarding house where the conspiracy had been planned; Lewis Powell, who had attempted to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward; George Atzerodt, who had been assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson but lost his nerve; David Herold, who had accompanied Booth; Samuel Mudd, the doctor who set Booth's leg, and 3 others: Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler. All were accused of conspiracy to murder the president. The trial was not a civilian proceeding. It was conducted by a military commission on the orders of President Johnson. The government argued that the conspirators had committed acts of war by targeting the commander-in-chief during a time of conflict. The defendants were not allowed to speak in their own defense. They were represented by lawyers, but the rules of evidence were looser than in civilian courts. The prosecution introduced hearsay, testimony from accomplices, and secret government reports. The defense argued that the military commission had no jurisdiction. The commission ignored that argument. The trial lasted for 7 weeks. On June 28th, the commission reached a verdict. All 8 defendants were found guilty. 4 of them, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Herold, were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 others received life sentences. Edmund Spangler was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The sentences were announced on July 5th. On July 7, 1865, at 1:15 p.m., the 4 condemned conspirators were hanged in the courtyard of the Washington Arsenal. The execution was public. Hundreds of officials and spectators watched. Mary Surratt wore a black dress and a veil. She was the first woman executed by the federal government of the United States. Lewis Powell stood stoically. George Atzerodt appeared terrified. David Herold wept. The traps were sprung simultaneously. The 4 bodies were left to hang for 20 minutes before being cut down. They were buried in shallow graves near the scaffold. The execution of Mary Surratt remains controversial. She was convicted largely on the testimony of a single witness who claimed she had known about the plot. Her son, John Surratt Jr., was a Confederate courier who had been involved with Booth. He was tried separately in a civilian court and acquitted. Many historians believe Mary Surratt was a victim of wartime hysteria. The military commission was determined to punish someone. The lenient treatment of Samuel Mudd and the others was inconsistent. The trial raised questions about the use of military tribunals to try civilians. Those questions remain relevant in the present day. The assassination also had direct consequences for the process of Reconstruction. President Andrew Johnson took office with a vision for the South that was far more lenient than Lincoln's. Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. He was a white supremacist. He believed that the former Confederate states should be readmitted quickly, without guarantees for black civil rights. He also believed that the wealthy planter class should be humiliated, but not the poor whites. His Reconstruction plan effectively pardoned most former Confederates and allowed them to regain power in the South. By the summer of 1865, Johnson had appointed provisional governors for the Southern states. He required only that they repudiate secession, abolish slavery, and ratify the 13th Amendment. He did not require that they grant voting rights to black men. He did not protect the freedmen from the Black Codes, which were laws passed in Southern states to restrict the freedom and labor of former slaves. The Black Codes created a system of near slavery. They limited where black people could live, what work they could do, and whether they could own property. The codes were enforced by local courts and sheriffs. The Northern Republicans were appalled. They had expected Johnson to be harsher on the South. Instead, he allowed the same men who had led the rebellion to return to office. In the congressional elections of 1866, Republicans won a veto-proof majority. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared black people citizens of the United States. They also passed the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law. Johnson vetoed both. Congress overrode his vetoes. The battle between Johnson and Congress defined the first 2 years of his presidency. The conflict came to a head in 1868. Johnson attempted to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was a holdover from Lincoln's cabinet and an ally of the radical Republicans. Stanton refused to leave. The House impeached Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. The Senate trial ended with a vote of 35 guilty to 19 not guilty, 1 vote short of the 2/3 needed to convict. Johnson remained in office, but his power was broken. He did not run for re-election. The election of 1868 brought Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency. Grant was a war hero. He supported the Reconstruction Acts and the use of federal troops to protect black voters. But his administration was plagued by scandal and economic crisis. Northern support for Reconstruction faded. The South was still resistant. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups used violence to suppress black political participation. The federal government could not maintain the military presence indefinitely. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was unraveling. The Panic of 1873 triggered a depression that shifted national attention to economic issues. The Supreme Court struck down key elements of the Reconstruction laws. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 and the United States v. Cruikshank decision in 1876, the court narrowed the scope of the 14th Amendment and effectively allowed Southern states to ignore black rights. The end of Reconstruction came in the election of 1876. The candidates were Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. The outcome was disputed. Tilden won the popular vote, but Hayes claimed the electoral vote. A special commission awarded the presidency to Hayes. In return, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. The Compromise of 1877 formally ended Reconstruction. The long-term consequences were devastating. By 1900, every Southern state had enacted laws that disenfranchised black voters. The system of Jim Crow segregation was enforced by law and by lynching. Black Americans were second-class citizens in the country that had fought a war to free them. The promise of equality under the law would not be realized for another century. Could Lincoln have prevented this? Historians have debated this question for generations. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was moderate but included protections for freedmen. He had proposed that at least 10% of a state's voters take an oath of loyalty before the state could be readmitted. He also supported the idea of limited black suffrage for those who were educated or had served in the Union Army. He had shown flexibility and political skill throughout his career. He might have been able to navigate the conflict between the radical Republicans and the Southern Unionists. He might have been able to impose a Reconstruction that was firm enough to protect black rights while being generous enough to avoid permanent resentment. But Lincoln was not a saint. He was a politician. He had compromised on slavery during the war. He had supported colonization of freed slaves outside the United States. He had moved slowly on emancipation. The assassination cut off his evolution at a critical moment. After his death, the nation lost its most experienced and most respected leader. The post-war period became a struggle of competing visions, none of which had Lincoln's authority. The assassination also transformed Lincoln into a myth. In death, he became the great emancipator, the martyred hero, the savior of the Union. That myth shaped American memory for generations. It also obscured the compromises and failures of his life. The real Lincoln, a complex and sometimes contradictory man, was replaced by a marble statue. The assassination fixed his image in the national consciousness as a figure beyond criticism. The same myth also fueled the lost cause narrative in the South. According to this narrative, the war was not about slavery. It was about states' rights and Northern aggression. The assassination was seen as a tragic act of desperation by a noble man, John Wilkes Booth. This interpretation allowed Southerners to honor the Confederacy while acknowledging Lincoln's greatness. It was a reconciliation that came at the expense of truth. The lost cause narrative minimized the role of slavery in the war and the assassination. It erased the experience of Black Americans. It persisted in textbooks, monuments, and popular culture for more than a century. In the 21st century, historians have reassessed the assassination and its context. They have emphasized the centrality of slavery to the conspiracy. They have examined the connections between Booth and the Confederate Secret Service. They have explored the ways in which the assassination was a response to Lincoln's growing commitment to emancipation. The assassination was not an isolated act of madness. It was a political act, carried out by a man who understood the stakes of the moment. The assassination also raised questions about presidential security that remain unanswered. The protective systems that exist today were built in response to Lincoln's death, but those systems have not prevented all attempts. The assassinations of Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy show that no amount of security can eliminate the risk entirely. The threats come from individuals who are determined and willing to die. The question of how to protect public officials while preserving democratic openness is unresolved. The Abraham Lincoln assassination was a turning point in American history. It removed the one man who might have steered the nation toward a just and peaceful reconciliation. It opened the door to a century of racial oppression. It turned Lincoln into a martyr and Booth into a symbol. The story of that night at Ford's Theater is not only a story of a bullet, it is a story of what might have been, what was lost, and what the nation chose to become in the years that followed. At 2 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1865, a single rider crossed the Navy Yard Bridge in Washington, D.C. The bridge spanned the Anacostia River. It was one of the few routes out of the city that was not heavily guarded. Rider was John Wilkes Booth. He had just killed the President of the United States. The guard at the bridge was a man named Sergeant Silas Cobb. Booth approached him and announced his name. He said he was heading home to the countryside. The guard was supposed to have orders to stop anyone after 9 p.m., but the orders had not been enforced. Cobb let him pass. Booth rode into the Maryland night. At the same time, another rider approached the bridge. It was David Herold, one of Booth's accomplices. He had been involved in the attack on Secretary of State William Seward. Seward had been stabbed multiple times but survived. Herold had fled the scene. He, too, crossed the Navy Yard Bridge without difficulty. The two men met up on the other side. They had a plan to rendezvous with other conspirators in southern Maryland. They had horses, supplies, and weapons. They believed they could reach the Confederacy and be hailed as heroes. The manhunt began almost immediately. By dawn on April 15th, the telegraph wires were buzzing with descriptions of the assassins. The War Department issued orders to block all roads and railways. But the communications were confused. There was no centralized command. The assassination had occurred in the midst of a city still celebrating the end of the war. The police force was small. The military was focused on demobilization. Booth and Herold slipped through the net. They rode south through Maryland. They stopped at a tavern owned by a known Confederate sympathizer. They asked for food and directions. The tavern keeper later recalled that Booth seemed calm, even cheerful. He spoke of having performed a great deed. The pair continued on. They hid in a pine thicket near the Potomac River. They waited for a boat to take them across into Virginia, but the boat did not come. The plan was falling apart. On April 16th, Booth and Herold came to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd was a physician and a farmer. He had met Booth before, but whether he recognized him immediately is disputed. Mudd set Booth's broken leg, which he had suffered during his leap to the stage at Ford's Theater. He gave them food and lodging. Later, Mudd would claim he did not know about the assassination, but the evidence suggested otherwise. He had been part of the Confederate underground network. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. He spent the rest of his life in prison. The delay at Dr. Mudd's house cost Booth precious time. Federal troops were closing in. On April 18th, the two men crossed the Potomac into Virginia. They were now in Confederate territory, but the Confederacy was collapsing. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered. There was no safe haven. They hid in swamps and forests. They learned from newspapers that the nation was in mourning. The public wanted revenge. By April 24th, the net had tightened. The War Department had tracked Booth's movements through informants and intercepted letters. A detachment of cavalry from the 16th New York Volunteer Cavalry was dispatched. They were led by Lieutenant Edward Doherty. They followed a tip from a Confederate spy named Willie Jett. Jett knew where the two men were hiding, at the Garrett family farm near Port Royal, Virginia. On the night of April 25th, the cavalry reached the farm. They surrounded the tobacco barn where Booth and Herold were staying. At 2 a.m. on April 26th, they closed in. Herold surrendered quickly. But Booth refused. He He shouted from inside the barn. He said he would not be taken alive. The soldiers set the barn on fire to force him out. As the flames rose, Booth was shot. The bullet struck him in the back of the neck. It was fired by Sergeant Boston Corbett, a Union soldier known for his eccentricity. Corbett later claimed he acted on his own initiative. Others said he was following orders. The official account was ambiguous. Booth was dragged from the burning barn. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He asked the soldiers to lift his hands so he could see them. He whispered his last words, "Tell my mother I died for my country." He died on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse at sunrise. His body was taken back to Washington, identified and buried in a secret location. The fate of his remains was kept hidden for years to avoid his grave becoming a shrine. The manhunt was over, but the investigation had only begun. What happened next was a trial unlike any in American history. The conspirators were not tried in a civilian court. They were tried by a military commission. President Johnson ordered the trial by military tribunal, arguing that the conspirators were enemies of the state and that civilian courts were not equipped to handle a case of such magnitude. The defense argued that the Constitution required a civil trial. The commission overruled. The defendants were held in irons. They were hooded. Their cells were kept dark. The treatment was designed to break them. The trial began on May 10, 1865. It lasted 2 months. There were 8 defendants: David Herold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Edmund Spangler, and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Each had played a role in the conspiracy. Mary Surratt owned the boarding house where the conspirators met. She was the first woman executed by the federal government. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. They showed that the conspiracy had been planned for weeks. Booth had recruited the others. They had initially planned to kidnap Lincoln, but when the war ended, Booth changed the plan to assassination. They had tracked Lincoln's movements. They had staked out Ford's theater. They had coordinated attacks on Seward and Vice President Johnson. Atzerodt had lost his nerve and failed to attack Johnson. Powell had attacked Seward but not killed him. Booth had succeeded. The defense argued that the conspiracy was not a unified plot. They claimed that Booth had acted alone. They pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony, but the commission was not persuaded. On June 30th, the verdicts were read. All 8 were found guilty. 4 were sentenced to death: Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt. The other 4 received life in prison or lesser sentences. On July 7, 1865, the executions were carried out. The gallows were built in the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington. The condemned were hanged at 1:26 p.m. Mary Surratt wore a black dress. She was supported by 2 soldiers as she walked to the scaffold. She protested her innocence. The trapdoor opened. The bodies were cut down after 20 minutes and buried in shallow graves. The public spectacle was meant to be a lesson. It also raised questions about due process. How could this have happened? How could a known actor, a man who had performed at Ford's theater multiple times, gain access to the president's box? How could a conspiracy of at least 8 people operate in the capital of the United States without being detected? Investigators later reconstructed the failures. There was no formal security detail for the president. Lincoln had only a single bodyguard, who was not present at the theater that night. The police had no protocol for protecting the chief executive. The War Department had intelligence about Confederate plots, but the information was not shared. Booth had been seen in the theater that day. He had been recognized. No one stopped him. The deeper failure was in intelligence gathering. The Union had a well-organized secret service, but it was focused on military matters. After Lee's surrender, the threat of political violence was underestimated. The assassination was not entirely unpredictable. Lincoln had received dozens of death threats. He had dismissed them. The government had no system for evaluating and responding to threats against civilian officials. The trial itself was controversial. The use of a military commission for civilians was later condemned by the Supreme Court in the case Ex parte Milligan, decided in 1866. The court ruled that military tribunals could not try civilians where civil courts were functional, but the ruling came too late for the conspirators. The execution of Mary Surratt, in particular, has been debated. She may have been guilty of harboring the conspirators, but the evidence was circumstantial. The commission's verdict was influenced by public outrage. The assassination also revealed the fragility of the constitutional order. The succession of Johnson was smooth, but the transition of power was not guaranteed. In the chaos of April 14th, there was confusion about who was in charge. The government could have collapsed. It did not, because the machinery of state functioned automatically. But the crisis had revealed vulnerability. The long-term impact on Reconstruction was already described. But the assassination also changed the nature of American public life. The presidency became a target. Security measures increased over the decades, but they were always reactive. The assassination of James Garfield in 1881, of William McKinley in 1901, and of John F. Kennedy in 1963 all followed a similar pattern. A motivated individual, a lapse in security, a public killing. The conspiracy theories that emerged after Lincoln's death have never fully disappeared. Some claim that high-ranking government officials were involved. Others suggested that the Catholic Church was behind it. Still others argued that the assassination was a Confederate plot directed by Jefferson Davis. Davis was never tried for his role. The evidence linking him to Booth was circumstantial, but the possibility of a larger conspiracy continues to haunt the historical record. What investigators did not find was a clear explanation of Booth's motives. He had left a letter. He wrote that he believed Lincoln was a tyrant. He thought the assassination would spark a Confederate revival. He was wrong. The South did not rise. The Union did not collapse. Booth's action only hardened Northern resolve. It turned Lincoln into a martyr. It discredited the cause of the Confederacy. It was a strategic failure, but for Booth himself, the act was a desperate gamble. He had no exit plan. He had no support network after the crossing into Virginia. He was a man driven by ideology and ego. He saw himself as a Brutus, a liberator. History saw him as a murderer. His name became synonymous with villainy. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a single event that changed the course of American history. It removed the one leader who might have balanced justice with reconciliation. It allowed the radical Republicans to dominate Reconstruction, which led to a backlash that created Jim Crow. It also created a myth of Lincoln that elevated him to the level of national saint. The myth was useful for unifying the country, but it also obscured the reality of his politics. The systems that failed on April 14, 1865, are still relevant today. Presidential security is now massive, but it is not perfect. The intelligence community tries to anticipate threats, but it cannot predict every individual. The legal system struggles to balance national security with civil liberties. The tensions that led to the assassination, over race, over the legitimacy of government, over the use of violence for political ends, are still present in American society. The story of that night at Ford's Theater is not only a story of a bullet. It is a story of what might have been, what was lost, and what the nation chose to become in the years that followed. But it is also a story of how a single act of violence can ripple through time. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not an accident of history. It was a calculated act by a man who understood that killing the president was a way to kill an idea. The idea did not die, but the man did, and the nation has never stopped asking what would have happened if he had lived. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The bullet from a Derringer pistol had entered behind his left ear and lodged behind his right eye. No surgeon could remove it. The president had been unconscious since the shooting at Ford's Theater approximately 9 hours earlier. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had taken charge of the scene, reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." But the story was far from over. The man who fired that shot was still out there. A 12-day manhunt was about to begin. At 10:15 p.m. on April 14th, John Wilkes Booth had fired the fatal shot. He had dropped the pistol, slashed a bystander with a knife, and leaped from the presidential box to the stage. His spur caught a flag draped over the box, and he landed awkwardly, fracturing his left fibula. Despite the injury, he limped across the stage, shouted "Sic Semper Tyrannis," and escaped through a back door. A horse was waiting. He rode into the night, meeting David Herold outside the city. Together, they fled into Maryland. The initial response was chaotic. The city of Washington went into lockdown. Soldiers guarded bridges and roads, but Booth had planned his escape carefully. He had previously stashed weapons and supplies along the route. He crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland before the alarm was fully raised. By midnight, he and Herold were on the road to Surrattsville, where they retrieved weapons hidden at Mary Surratt's tavern. They then rode to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg. Mudd later claimed he did not know who Booth was, but the evidence suggested otherwise. On April 16th, the War Department issued a reward of $100,000 for the capture of the assassins. The equivalent today would be nearly $2 million. Photographs and descriptions were distributed by telegraph. The search involved thousands of soldiers, detectives, and civilians, but the manhunt was hampered by a lack of coordination. The military districts did not share information efficiently. Local police were not integrated into the effort. Confederate sympathizers in southern Maryland provided shelter and misinformation. Booth and Herold spent 5 days hiding in a pine thicket near the Zekiah Swamp. They were supplied by local sympathizers. They read newspapers that reported the assassination and the public mourning. Booth wrote in his diary, "I am abandoned with the curse of Cain upon me. When I read the papers, I am struck with the contrast between the treatment of my people and that of a similar case in the North. The North are not forgiving. They are eager for revenge." On April 21st, they attempted to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. The crossing was delayed by rain and federal patrols. Booth and Herold found a boat and rowed across during the night of April 22nd. They landed near the mouth of the Rappahannock River. From there, they moved inland, hoping to reach the deep South where Confederate sympathizers might still provide refuge. But by April 23rd, the dragnet was tightening. The War Department had deployed cavalry units along every major route. Telegraph lines carried descriptions of Booth and Herold to every post office and military command. The search was no longer haphazard. Colonel Lafayette C. Baker, head of the National Detective Police, took personal charge. He dispatched a detachment of 25 soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry under the command of Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty. They were ordered to search the Virginia countryside methodically. On April 24th, the detachment crossed the Potomac at Belle Plaine. They acquired a guide, a local farmer named William Rowlands, who led them toward the Rappahannock. By then, Booth and Herold had reached the farm of Richard H. Garrett, a tobacco farmer near Port Royal, Virginia. They presented themselves as Confederate soldiers returning from the war. Garrett allowed them to stay in his tobacco barn. He was suspicious but did not alert authorities. On the night of April 25th, the cavalry detachment arrived at the Garrett farm. They surrounded the barn. Lieutenant Doherty called for the men inside to surrender. Herold came out immediately. Booth refused. He shouted that he would not be taken alive. Doherty ordered the barn set on fire. Soldiers heaped straw against the walls and lit it. As the flames rose, Booth could be seen inside, still armed. A soldier named Boston Corbett, acting without orders, fired through a crack in the barn wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. He was dragged from the burning barn, paralyzed from the shoulders down. Booth lived for 3 more hours. He asked to see his hands. He whispered, "Tell my mother I die for my country." He asked that his body be taken to his mother. He died at dawn on April 26, 1865. The man who had killed Abraham Lincoln was dead. The manhunt was over. The body was brought back to Washington on a small boat. It was identified by friends and family. An autopsy was performed on the ironclad USS Montauk. The bullet had entered just above the collar and exited near the shoulder. The body was then secretly buried under the floor of a storage room at the old penitentiary in Washington. It was later moved to a grave in the Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, under a false name. The family never received the body, but the death of Booth did not end the story. The conspiracy trial of the 8 other defendants was already underway. The trial began on May 10, 1865, before a military commission of 9 officers. The defendants were held in irons. Hoods were placed over their heads to prevent communication. The trial lasted until June 30th. The commission heard testimony from over 300 witnesses. The evidence ranged from eyewitness accounts to letters from Booth. The verdict was delivered on June 30th. 4 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging: David Herold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. 3 were sentenced to life in prison: Samuel Arnold, Samuel Mudd, and Michael O'Laughlin. 1, Edmund Spangler, was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The executions were carried out on July 7, 1865, at the old penitentiary in Washington. Mary Surratt was the first woman executed by the federal government. She was hanged while wearing a black dress. The rope snapped at the knot, and she died slowly. The speed of the trial and execution reflected the mood of the nation. There was no patience for due process. The military commission operated under rules of evidence that would not have been accepted in a civilian court. The defendants were not allowed to testify in their own defense. The verdicts were predetermined by public opinion. The Supreme Court later ruled in Ex parte Milligan that military trials of civilians were unconstitutional, but the ruling came in 1866, too late to help the executed. The question of whether Mary Surratt was guilty remains a point of debate. She had allowed the conspirators to meet at her boarding house. She had carried a package to her tavern on the night of the assassination, but she may not have known the full plan. Her son, John Surratt, had been involved with Booth but fled to Canada and later to Europe. He was eventually captured and tried in a civilian court in 1867. That trial ended with a hung jury. He was never convicted. The assassination of Lincoln exposed the failure of security systems that were not designed for peacetime threats. The president had no permanent bodyguard. The Metropolitan Police had a 4-man detail assigned to the White House, but they were not always present. On the night of the assassination, the president's personal guard, John F. Parker, had left his post. He was later found to have a history of drinking and dereliction. He was not punished. The system of intelligence gathering was primitive. The War Department had informants in the South, but there was no centralized agency to analyze threats. Warnings had been received about Booth. He had been seen at Ford's Theater during the day. He had been overheard boasting about something big. None of these signals were connected. The failure was not one of resources, but of coordination. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the nature of the threat. Booth was not a foreign agent. He was an actor from a well-connected family. He moved freely in society. He had access to the theater. He knew the layout of the building and the habits of the president. The security system was designed to protect against mob violence or Confederate raids, not against a single determined individual with a derringer. The assassination changed the way the nation thought about presidential security. In 1865, there was no Secret Service. The agency was created in 1865 to combat counterfeiting, not to protect the president. It was not until after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901 that the Secret Service was assigned to protect the president. The lesson of Lincoln's death was that the nation could not rely on ad hoc arrangements. The threat was real, and the protection must be systematic. But the deeper lesson is about the fragility of democratic institutions. The assassination came at a moment when the nation was already divided. The war had ended, but the peace was uncertain. The removal of Lincoln opened the door to a reconstruction that was harsher and more punitive. It also created a myth of the martyred president that would be used to justify both the expansion of federal power and the suppression of dissent. The assassination was not just a crime. It was a political act that reshaped American history. The final unanswered question is whether Lincoln's survival would have changed the course of Reconstruction. Historians have debated this for over a century. Some argue that Lincoln would have pursued a policy of moderation, granting amnesty to former Confederates and protecting the rights of freedmen. Others argue that the radical Republicans in Congress would have blocked him, and that the outcome would have been similar regardless. What is clear is that the assassination removed the one figure who could have provided moral authority and political leadership at a critical juncture. Lincoln had won a second term. He had the confidence of the North. He had articulated a vision of reconciliation in his second inaugural address. He had begun to plan for the readmission of Southern states. His death left a void that Andrew Johnson could not fill. Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat, and a racist. He clashed with Congress and was nearly impeached. The consequences of that failure are still visible today. The failure to integrate African Americans into the political and economic life of the nation led to a century of segregation, violence, and inequality. The Southern states enacted black codes, then Jim Crow laws, then the Ku Klux Klan enforced white supremacy through terror. The federal government did not intervene. The wounds of the Civil War were not healed. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, then, was not only the murder of a man, it was the murder of a possibility. The nation lost the chance to build a just peace. The systems that failed that night were not just the security apparatus of the Capitol. They were the systems of governance, of foresight, of political will. The assassination revealed that a democracy can be undone by a single bullet if the structures of protection and justice are not strong enough. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the 16th President of the United States died. The war was over. The peace had not yet begun. The story of that night, of the manhunt, of the trial, of the executions, and of the long aftermath, is a story of how a nation responded to an act of violence. It responded with vengeance, with haste, with confusion, and with determination. But it also responded by building a mythology around the fallen leader that would shape the country for generations. Lincoln became a symbol. He was no longer a politician with flaws and compromises. He became the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the martyr of democracy. That myth served a purpose. It unified the North. It gave meaning to the sacrifices of the war. But it also obscured the real man and the real choices he made. The assassination did not just kill Lincoln. It turned him into a legend, and legends are easier to honor than to understand. The story ends where it began, in a box at Ford's Theater with a man waiting for a cue. Booth knew the play. He knew when the audience would laugh. He knew when the actors would turn away. He knew that the moment the audience laughed most loudly was the moment no one would hear a gunshot. The bullet entered the brain. The humor died. The nation changed. The manhunt began. The trial followed. The executions came. And then the long, slow work of remembering and forgetting. 150 years later, the questions remain. What if the guard had stayed at his post? What if the cavalry had found Booth a day earlier? What if Lincoln had survived? The answers will never be known. But the tragedy of April 14, 1865, is that it did not have to happen. The systems that failed were human systems. The men who failed were human men. And the consequence was the death of a president and the derailment of a nation at its most fragile moment. That is the boring, terrible history of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.